This is pretty much a YP. I write, I edit, I post, and occasionally when posting and rereading I see something I want to change, or have to change because it will affect something later in the story. Hopefully this will not happen that often. Thanks for reading. No. I started to respond when an upraised claw stopped me. Officially no. Unofficially hell's no. You don't understand. They are heroes to us. We betray them. We betray ourselves. I sighed inwardly. We Slayesh like to believe we are honorable, and sometimes we are, but for the most part, we tend to be pragmatic, or at least think we are being pragmatic. The Sranesh clans, though, they were honor personified, and they spent most of their evolutionary cycle developing ways to practice and emphasize that honor. A loose confederation of clans, the only way to get them to fight together was to attack one or more of their clans. Sometimes you could play them against each other, as we had done in the past, but they had their part of the universe claimed, and the few times their neighbors tried doing anything about it were few and far between, and short and bloody. They usually spent more time fighting each other, but if they ever decided to get their act together and fight as a singular whole, there would be problems. And there's no compensation we can give to get you to reconsider? I asked. No. The translation was flat and artificial, but the grunt of the Sranesh was most empathetic. Is this related to Kithnia? I asked. 1/6 Blue Feathers stared at me for a moment, then nodded. Follow, he said, gesturing. I did. The ship was dimly lit, but well maintained. As we walked the passageways, other members in the hall stood aside and saluted, hands to chest, bowing. They ignored me. After a short walk and lift ride, followed by yet another short walk and another ride, we entered a spare, austere room. 1/6 went to a cubby and pulled out a pair of hand-woven mats, then set them on the floor. Sit, he said, gesturing at one. He went to another cubby and pulled out a NIK neural interface kit. I sat, and he stepped behind me, placing it on my head. The sensation as the NIK molded itself to my skull was slightly disconcerting, but a minute or so later, it was done. 1/6 sat in front of me, lit a small bundle of reeds that soon filled the room with a pungent, bitter smell. Breathe like me, he said, pointing at himself. In, out, relax. There was a tingling sensation on my head, then a brief stab of pain, color, and light I could see with my eyes closes, and then... What is that? The Terran, Kenneth was his name, was pointing up at the sky. It was nighttime, but the device Kenneth was wearing allowed him to see things quite well. Meteorite? Yevgeny asked, his accent thick. No, I don't think so, Kenneth said. The radio on his belt screeched to life. LP1, be advised we have unknown contacts in system. No count as of yet, but they have not answered and comms are silent. Central copy, keep us appraised, Kenneth said. He looked at us. Let's get back to the camp. I liked the Terran. Despite the weather. He was usually cheerful, and despite the fact the software glitches were all too routine and common, he and his crew attacked each one with gusto, a problem waiting to be solved. They were all very good at their jobs as well. Their geology skills were a lot better than anyone in our small cluster as well. They had already identified several seams of metals and a large reservoir of hydrocarbons that, if mined, would help us break even that much sooner. And some of their technology for recovering it was better than ours as well. I had initially scoffed when Father had brought them on as consultants, but their expertise had already paid for the fee twice over. We were close to the base when the radio screeched into life. LP, we are under attack. Repeat, we are under attack. By unknown and overwhelming forces. Am attempting to evade to get the buoy away, but it's not looking good. Yevgeny stood on the vehicle's brakes, throwing many of us forward. Kenneth had hopped off before the GPV had even stopped, fiddling with the glasses. What do you see? Colin asked. I see. Damn. It's gone, Kenneth said. He kept staring off into space. Whomever is up there is destroying everything. Colin stepped forward and put a hand on Kenneth's shoulder. Just a sec, he said, typing on the keyboard on his arm. A few seconds later, he took a deep breath. Fuck, they're Drogas. What do we do? 1-3 Quinesh asked. We fight, 1-2 Reckon said, voice grim. We lose, 1-1 Red Corona said. His voice was also grim. We were not a big clan, just over 1,000 men, women, and children. We had been given this stake by Elder 2-2 Green Sky to build a new cadet line of the clan. It looked like we were going to fail before we even had a chance. Honor sacrifice, 1-2 Reckon asked. Just a quick reminder before we get started, only 4% of my viewers have subscribed to the channel so far. If you enjoy the content, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to hit that subscribe button and support the channel. Thank you so much. If need be, 1-1 Red Corona replied. It would be better than what short life we would have as a slave. We will need volunteers for the fight, 1-3 Kunesh said. I'll go, a new voice said. I looked up. Kenneth's friend, James, had come over, unnoticed, and was listening into our conversation. You, 1-3 said. I am going, James said, and I will fight anyone who tries to stop me. He pulled a particularly wicked-looking blade out from under his jacket. We can discuss what we need to do, 1-3 replied. We need to prepare the others. For what? James asked. The Drogas will land. Their intent is to capture, not kill. You know what happens on a Drogan slaver. All-Father gives us the choice. We can choose to endure, or we can choose to sacrifice our honor before captured. You mean kill yourself? James asked in shock, eyes going wide. It was amazing how expressive their face was. Yes, 1-3 replied. Fuck that shit, James said. And what will you do? 1-3 asked. James looked at us for a few moments, his jaw clenching. My entire life was aboard the Costigian. It's been my home for 7 years now. My friends were on it when it was destroyed. You know Kenneth is my brother-in-law, yes? We did not, and it took a brief explanation to get its meaning. His wife, my sister, and daughter were aboard the ship. She was 6 months pregnant. At that moment, a group of younglings, kicking a ball between them, went running and screaming past our gathering. We all stared at them, visions of what we might have to do flashing before our eyes. They want to capture us, enslave us, work us to death, and discard us, James said. He glanced over his shoulder where a group of Terrans had gathered. Make them earn that privilege, he said. Make them bleed before you take your own life. Die on your feet with your honor, so that the All-Father will welcome you with open arms. Or die on your knees like a coward, praying All-Father takes you from the misery you accepted when you surrendered. He nodded, then turned around and walked. Over to his friends and co-workers were. What arrogance, 2-6 Joggin said. He's right, 1-1 Red Corona said, looking ashamed. But nothing, 1-1 snapped. He is right, and after a long life lived well, we deserve the opportunity to walk with the All-Father as intended. When 1-1 called a clan meet and told everyone what had happened, there was little protesting. An hour or so later, when the third family had been found in their hab, his anger as he castigated those thinking of doing the same was evident. He called down all sorts of wrath and ruin on those 3 families, going so far as to call the first one cowards, cast them from the clan, and ordering their remains to be placed face down. The next few hours were organized chaos. The settlement hadn't been designed with defense in mind, but 3-1 Warden and his clutch, aided by the Terrans, soon had a basic defensive works in place. The Terran Forge had produced several thousand, large containers, big reinforced woven plastic bags that when filled with dirt, rocks, and tailings from the mine, required heavy equipment to move it into place, and once placed, they were pretty much immovable. The settlement was effectively walled off, and within the settlement more walls had been built. Then Yevgeny, with a lot of cursing and a bit of code, adjusted the forge parameters so it could start producing weapons. What material we had to make firearms was quickly used, but there were other options available. What about the transmitter? It's been sending every time it charges. Any chance we can get anyone away? With no food or shelter on a planet that's going to be entering the cold cycle in a couple of months. No. How's Kenneth? Sad. Pissed off, like we all are. Do we have a plan? Yes, but so did Custer. We can do better than him, as long as we take more of them than us. The Drogas ship overflew the compound at well over the speed of sound, the aftershock shaking the habs and some equipment. There was a clearing a few clicks away, large enough for several ships to land in. When the ship flew over, it saw a small group clustered near the center. It circled, landed, and a few minutes later, the ramp lowered and the door irised open. A roiling cloud of yellowish, brackish-smelling atmosphere came out, and then the shadows in the mist grew, and the Dragos came out. Their suits were bulky, but effective, and often modified by their wearer. It was easy to pick out the leader. He was a head taller than the other as his group, and had several skulls of various creatures hanging from a belt on his side. A Dragos earned rank by the number of captures he made. As a result, while in space, they were okay with ranged weapons, kinetics, missiles, and the like. During the raiding parties, they preferred to get up close and personal. "Try not to gag," James said. "Too late," another Terran said. The pheromone blockers their doctor had come up with seemed to be working. One of the reasons the Drogas were feared was the stench they gave off, but in this case, whatever the Terrans had worked up for, themselves and us seemed to be working. We weren't scared, but yes, the stench was overwhelming. They stopped about 20 feet away from us. The leader spoke, a series of hissing noises that his suit translated. "Surrender or die, I do not care which." "No," Kenneth said. There was a moment's pause, and then what was translated as laughter came out. A hissing, burbling sound. Kenneth turned to look at Yevgeny. "Now?" Yevgeny nodded, and Kenneth stepped forward, reaching inside his jacket and removing a kinetic hand weapon. Several loud cracks filled the air, and 3 of the 5 who had come off the ships fell to the ground, their suits' atmosphere coming out of the hole in their now destroyed faceplates, which were now coated on the inside with bone and viscera. The 4th jerked away in enough time that the heavy slug glanced of it. But before he could pull his own sidearm, 4-7 Hentar had leapt forward and stabbed him with his Gektarl. A twist, a shove, and a pull, the Dragos innards were soon outside his suit. With a roar, and moving faster than someone that big had any right to move, the leader had pulled his neural whip clear, and it lashed out, catching 4-7's arm. He screamed in pain and fell to the ground, until Kenneth stepped forward and fired his remaining rounds into the leader's knees and torso. We all drew back, then heard several whines as the dorsal turret on top of the ship began to turn. "Yevgeny," Kenneth said, as the rest of us looked for a place to hide in a wide open field devoid of cover. "Blyat!" Yevgeny swore, turning the handle on the device he was holding on more time, then hit a button, with the first, crump. Nothing happened, and we all dove out of the way as the dorsal turret began to fire. A second or so later, as it chewed the ground up a few feet in front of my head, there was a succession of louder crumps. And then, with the loudest one, the dorsal turret stopped firing, and there was the sound of screeching metal. The ground shook quite violently as a loud explosion rent the sky, and when I hazarded a look, I saw the ship sitting in 2 parts, oily-looking smoke and atmosphere spewing into the sky. A jet of hot blue flame erupted from a hole, then died out. A few seconds later, radiation alarms on our belts were going off. "Crap," said James. "Sorry," replied Evgeny. "Should not have tripled charges." "Later," Kenneth said, reloading his weapon. He looked over at the leader, who was by some miracle untouched by the turret fire. "Get the cross ready." Kethset Elisha Ox strode down the ship's ramp, laughing at what he was seeing. Kethset Gauxkurl had literally walked, into the ambush set for him, and had not only lost his ship, but any claim going forward. The radiological alarm was going off. Obviously, one of the ship's reactors had been breached, but the radiation was not enough that it would matter at this point. He saw Gauxkurl a short distance away, on some sort of crude contraption made of the local wood. His arms were splayed out, he was hanging by them, held up by several neural whips. His arms and torso were a bloody mess, but someone had patched the cracks in his helmet. "Well, your foolishness finally caught up to you this time, didn't it?" he laughed. Gauxkurl said something, but it was lost in the hiss coming from his suit. "He had this on his body, Kethset." Kethnan Keedale handed over a piece of formed plastic ard. There was something written on it in Sranesh. He scanned it, then waited a second for his suit to translate it. "Next time, don't send a girl to do a man's job," Elisha Ox gurgled in laughter, holding the plastic ard back out to Keedle. Have a crew salvage what's left of Gaukryl's ship. Let him watch as it happens. Let's get a scout party together and see what we are up against. He waited for Kidulul to answer and realized his subordinate had not taken the plastic ard. When he looked over, he started, for Kidul was standing upright, but the massive hole in his faceplate and the gore the interior was over in meant he wouldn't be standing for long. Shot! The word flashed on his screen, and before he could react, the 12.7mm tungsten slug penetrated his own faceplate, entering just below his second eye and exiting out the back of his helmet, taking most of his primary brainstem with it. Move, Yevgeny said, hoisting the sniper rifle up and running back into the woods. A few seconds later, radiation alarms on our belts were going off. Crap, said James. Sorry, replied Evgeny. Should not have tripled charges. Later, Kenneth said, reloading his weapon. He looked over at the leader, who was by some miracle untouched by the turret. Ire, get the cross ready. Kethset Elisha Ox strode down the ship's ramp, laughing at what he was seeing. Kethset Gaukril had literally walked, into the ambush set for him, and had not only lost his ship but any claim going forward. The radiological alarm was going off. Obviously, one of the ship's reactors had been breached, but the radiation was not enough that it would matter at this point. He saw Gaukril a short distance away, on some sort of crude contraption made of the local wood. His arms were splayed out, he was hanging by them, held up by several neural whips. His arms and torso were a bloody mess, but someone had patched the cracks in his helmet. Well, your foolishness finally caught up to you this time, didn't it? He laughed. Gaukril said something, but it was lost in the hiss coming from his suit. He had this on his body, Kethset. Kethnan Kidil handed over a piece of formed plastic ard. There was something written on it, in Srenesh. He scanned it, then waited a second for his suit to translate it. Next time, don't send a girl to do a man's job. Elisha Ox gurgled in laughter, holding the plastic ard back out to Kidul. Have a crew salvage what's left of Gaukryl's ship. Let him watch as it happens. Let's get a scout party together and see what we are up against. He waited for Kidulul to answer and realized his subordinate had not taken the plastic ard. When he looked over, he started, for Kidul was standing upright, but the massive hole in his faceplate and the gore the interior was over in meant he wouldn't be standing for long. Shot! The word flashed on his screen, and before he could react, the 12.7mm tungsten slug penetrated his own faceplate, entering just below his second eye and exiting out the back of his helmet, taking most of his primary brainstem with it. Move, Yevgeny said, hoisting the sniper rifle up and running back into the woods. A few seconds later, he heard the report of Gennady firing from the other side of the landing, then cut a hard left as random incoming laser fire hit the trees behind him. I watched 3 weeks' worth of fighting. I watched as Terran and Srenesh fought side by side, goading the Dragos into fatal attacks, watched as one of the few remaining Kethset got smart and started using his numerical advantage, bleeding the defenders. One of the Terrans was captured, by a Kethset, then flayed alive a distance away as the settlement watched. A few days later, the senior Kethnan woke up to find the Kethset's decapitated head on his chest, and no idea how it got there. The trained warriors and Terrans began to fall singly at first, then by ones and twos daily. Other Srenesh stepped up, taking their comrades' place, fighting until they were overcome. Things got worse when Doc Patricks, the Terran medico, was killed in one of the first artillery strikes. It was his expertise that had returned many, a wounded Terran to the battlefield, his pheromone potions and chemical tricks playing merry hell with the Dragos, who tried to retaliate in kind. I watched a Terran, spear in one hand, sidearm in the other, dive of the top of a makeshift parapet into a group of Dragos, hacking, slashing, firing, buying his compatriots enough time to rebuild the section of wall that had fallen down. He did not return, but took more with him than I expected, including 2 Kethnan trying to claim him as a prize. The last died in shock, as the Terran, bound with neural whips, managed to muster enough strength to swing his spear into the Kethnans, faceplate before dying himself. I watched the one called Yevgeny, who had been wounded in the stomach and was going to die no matter what the Srenish doctor and his small team could do, don a Dragos suit, waddle into one of their encampments in the middle of the day, and detonate the mining charge he had taken with him. The fateful turn happened when one of the key defensive positions fell to an artillery strike before the last of the mining drones found the artillery tube and detonated near it. By this time, most of the settlement had been destroyed. The inhabitants had retreated into the cavern that had been rapidly expanded when the Dragos had landed. There was little food inside, little water, not much for sanitation. But the door was the shuttle bay door from the colony ship, a foot thick of polyceramic and steel that would require a massive amount of firepower to breach. Until the earthquake hit, a minor tremor, but enough to cause a landslide that knocked out most of the solar panels and generator that powered the electrics inside the cavern. We could shut and lock the door and lose the air and water recycling, or keep the air and water recycling and lose the door locks. It was bad engineering. However, it meant the Drogas had to attack in an enclosed space, and they started throwing themselves at the defenders, forcing them back, then retreating and regrouping, then attacking again. The door was shut, but it could be opened. And the Dragos found out when they captured 1-3 Quinesh and tortured him to death for it. I'm a constable, and even I was aghast at what they did to him to get that information. The Terrans were a confusing lot, with a propensity to name everything they had built or fought on. Phase lines, fields of fire, concepts like that we knew quite well. But they named the defensive walls. Sometimes the whole wall, sometimes just sections. Some of the names were used before the fighting started. Rourke, Stalingrad, Chosin, Reanaudot. Others after a fight had taken place. Tlacopan, Kursk, Quetta, Glen Station. They had used others as well, the names foreign to me. The cavern they called Masada. Kenneth was thinner, a scar on his face, his left arm a bloody mess. 2-6 Joggin stood next to him, as well as the least injured Shrenesh. Behind them stood more Shrenesh and the last few humans able to fight, James, Istvan, Phil. All were looking back and forth. They humans all shared the same expression. Determination. Fate, acceptance. We hold here, Kenneth said, coughing. He spat, and the tunnel wall got a little redder. You fight till you are tired, then you fall back. Let the next line take your place. They aren't going to be able to use their whips, and they are supposed to be low on ammunition. We were low on ammunition as well. The last of the forges had been destroyed in the earthquake when several rocks from the cavern ceiling had fallen. No matter what happens, Kenneth said, we hold them here. The look on his face was one of determination. Kenneth, Istvan said, standing up. May I? Kenneth nodded, then knelt down. The rest of the humans did as well. The Shrenesh remained, standing but bowed their heads. Istvan pulled out a canteen, poured what was left of his water into a field cup, then walked up to Kenneth. He dipped his finger in the water, then drew a cross on Kenneth's forehead, cleaning away the blood and dirt that was there. As he moved around the small assembly, doing the same to each Terran and Srenish, he spoke. Desetero fratres, confortamini in domino, et in potentia virtutis ejus, induite vos armaturam Dei, ut possitis stare adversus insidias diaboli, quoniam. Non est nobis colluctatio adversus carnem et sanguinem, sed adversus principes, e potestates, adversus mundi rectores tenebrarum harum, contra spiritualia nequitia, in celestibus. Proptere accipite armaturam Dei, ut possitis resistere in die, malo, et in omnibus perfecti stare, stat ergo succinti lumbos vestros in veritate, et induti loricam justitiae, et calciati pedes in preparatione evangeli pacis, in omnibus sumentes scutum fidei, in quo possitis omnia tela nequissimi ignea extinguere, et galeam salutis assumite, et gladium spiritus, quod est verbum Dei, per omnem orationem et obsecrationem orantes omni tempore in spiritu, et in ipso vigilantes in omni instantia et obsecratione pro omnibus sanctis, et pro me, ut detur mihi sermo in apertione oris mei cum fiducia, notum facere mysterium evangelii, pro collegatione fungere in catena ita ut in ipso audeam proudo portet me loqui. Contact, one of the voices called out from behind them. 50 meters. Kenneth knelt down, motioning his hand in front of his body, speaking quietly. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory, forever and ever. He stayed kneeling for a moment, then lifted his arm and kissed the Gektarl he had been carrying for the better part of 2 weeks now. I noticed he wasn't the only one who prayed. Most of the Terrans had as well, although in a few places the words were different. In nomine Patris, et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. He stood up, then raised the simple wooden cross he had been wearing since arrival, the thin gold band strung through the cord holding them both. I love you, Julie. I'll see you and Rachel soon. There was a pop and hiss. The corridor began to fill up with smoke. After a brief kiss, the cross went under his shirt. Pulling his makeshift mask up around his face, Kenneth stood up, then with a feral scream, charged, Gektarl at the low ready. Jesus Christ, what a mess. That was an understatement. The settlement was destroyed. There were few structures left standing, and they were missing roofs, walls, or both. A few were still on fire. There were bodies everywhere, in various states of decay. The shuttle flared, Gunny Sims jumping out before it had touched down, Lieutenant Grimes and the rest of the Toon not too far behind him. Up ahead, sir, Gunny said as the rest of us spread out. The ground was a wet, muddy mess the closer we got. To the tunnel entrance, the muddier and bloodier it got, the more bodies were piled up, Drogras, Srenesh, and all too few humans. The wind shifted and we all caught a whiff before the filters kicked in. Someone started to retch. And you call yourself Recon, Gunny Sims said, sadness in his voice. The tunnel floor was also covered with bodies. One of the Srenesh Marines made his way over, looking at a tablet, speaking, his suit translating. 50 meters, give or take. There's been some recent seismic activity as well. Lieutenant Grimes nodded, looking around. Let's set some details up to look for survivors out here. Cash is landing shortly and is going to set up over there probably. He gestured to a clearing. You come across anyone, code them accordingly. And the Dragos, sir? Gunny asked. Lieutenant Grimes looked around, seeing a few Drogas bodies moving feebly or twitching. They're all dead, he said, looking directly at the Gunny, who nodded. Put them in a pile somewhere over there, he gestured to the opposite side of the settlement. We'll set some charges and burn them all later. He turned to see the Srenesh Marine officer looking at him through his own suit. Problem, Captain? No, Lieutenant. There's work to be done, was the reply, and both teams began to move forward. Jesus Christ! Connolly's statement was cut off by a loud whang as the Gunny's hand whacked him in the back of his helmet. I warned you, Connolly, he growled. Say it again and I take your helmet off, understand? Yes, Gunny, the tunnel was a charnel house. Blood, bones, bodies everywhere. It was apparent the defenders had done their best, but the Dragos' weight in numbers had come into play. Doors right ahead, sir. I can see most of it, Sergeant Hammerly said. Most of it? Too many bodies in front. It's still shut, sir. Right. Going to have to clear it before we can open it. It swings out. Right, sir. Doc! The call broke through all channels. Doc, need you and yours at the door now. We've 2 alive, 1 of ours and theirs. A few seconds later, there was a thundering of footsteps rushing down the tunnel. Make way! The lieutenant called out, and everyone who wasn't a medic made themselves as small as they could against the walls. Multiple GSW, multiple shrapnel wounds. Looks like a puncture wound near the right kidney. Crap. He's crashing. Doc Gilmore tore open what was left of the man's makeshift suit, slapping the autodoc on him, pushing a series of buttons, then pulled a few autosyringes out of his own bag of tricks and stabbing them in one at a time. At the same time, his assistants had opened the stretcher and moved the male onto it. Doc checked the autodoc, then he pulled out 2 units and attached them. You, he said, handing the bags to Connolly. Squeeze them till they're empty, then add my own, Connolly said, grabbing them and starting to squeeze. Correct. Go. Doc slapped Connolly on the leg. "Run like your ex-wife is chasing you for alimony, Connolly," Gunny called out. "I need Surgeon 22 White Feathers here now." Doc screamed, pulling out another unit from his backpack. The Srenesh medical team was running its way back down the tunnel, and Doc Grimes fell down, hitting his head against the massive door, which made a clanging noise. The Srenesh surgeon, his arms covered in their greenish blood, also sat down. A few seconds later, there was another clanging sound, this time from the other side of the door. Everyone looked at each other for a moment, then there was a flurry of activity. "Surgeon," Lieutenant Grimes said, "we'll open the door. You and yours go in first, okay?" The surgeon nodded. "This is not weird at all, sir," Gunny said. He was standing with his helmet off, holding it in one arm. They were outside the cache tent, and everyone in the cavern was sitting beside it. Those who had needed medical attention had received it. Very few were still inside the tent. Many were covered in blankets, eating the plain soup the Srenesh kitchen had made. There was little talking. The door slid open, and Doc Grimes came out. He saw the lieutenant and shook his head slightly. A few seconds later, the Srenesh surgeon came out and stood silently. "Lieutenant Gunny, if you would," Doc said, gesturing them inside. "His name is Kenneth Patricks. I understand he is from a planet called Air. 26 Yagan standard was decent, but neither the lieutenant or Gunny corrected him of the mispronunciation. He was part of the science crew we hired to help us. He had a wife and young daughter who were killed aboard their ship during the initial Drogas attack. He coordinated the defense here. How is he?" "He is alive," Surgeon Whitefeathers said. "Unfortunately, his injuries are too severe, and he will most likely not live past the cycle. The Drogas poisoned their blades at the end. We don't know what they used. I thought we had a serum for it, but it made things worse. His own cells are attacking his body. We do not know how to fix it." "I am alive because of him," 26 said. "We knew something was up when the remaining Drogas began to throw themselves at us. Then James fell, then 3-3 Wessel fell, then it was just us two. He was going to throw our last grenade, but he got hit as he threw it and he covered my body with his. He saved me." The room was silent. "Sir," 26 said, "I would beg a favor of you." He looked at the lieutenant. They wheeled 26 into the same room and with some help raised him to a sitting position next to Kenneth. The human was prone on his back, a mask over his face, tubes in his arms, beeping noises indicating things I was not sure of. Surgeon Whitefeathers had set up what looked to be a recording device, then with a nod from the lieutenant, placed something on the human's head. "Whatever happens," the lieutenant said over his shoulder to those assembled. Behind him, "Do not move, do not interrupt." The assembled humans in the room nodded. 26 leaned over Kenneth, placing his hands on his head. Then he started to sing. There were no words, just tones, and a few seconds after he started, the Srenesh assembly outside joined in. A single voice at first, then more, until they were all joined in a chorus of notes that was beautiful and raw with emotion. The lieutenant went to the one-way window and saw them all standing, arms raised to the sky, and when he turned back, he saw a nimbus of light surrounding Kenneth's head. A few moments later, 26 raised his hands, and the gathered light followed. When he had it close to his own head, he twirled his hands and it started to spin in place. Still singing, he lowered his head until it was almost touching Kenneth's. The lights grew, changing color, spinning faster, then began to move through his body. 26 levered himself upright to standing and pulled his arms back. The lights followed, up and around his head, glowing and pulsing and changing in color and vibrancy. A few seconds later, with another motion of his hands, he pushed the light away from his own head. It floated away, then through the cache wall, where one of the elder Srenesh grabbed it with his own whirling hands and, still singing, turned, and after changing his own voice to a new tone, sent the now pieces of light into the assembly. For the next couple of minutes, the gathered Srenesh sang. They motioned with their own hands, the light splitting up, growing bigger and smaller, changing color, moving from person to person, until they reached the end of the assembly, people pushing the lights together until they joined again into a large luminescent ball, where the last participant, a young Srenesh female, grabbed it, pulled it to her. With one last sung note, a low melodic tone that was as beautiful as it was haunting, it winked out as she was grasping it to her chest. My eyes snapped open. I looked at the chrono. Less than an hour had passed. I lived 3 weeks' worth of memories in less than an hour. I was James. I was Kenneth. I was 2611. I was feeling too much. Whatever emotion was on my face was enough to get 16 blue feathers moving. He leaned forward and took the NIK of my head, setting on the mat beside me. I fought the urge to rub where it had touched. "Thank you for sharing that with me," I said, bowing, swallowing. A Srenish memory was a unique experience for anyone it was shared with. It made me want to throw up, which I found out later was a common reaction. My stomachs were roiling, and I was afraid I might retch. 1. 6 nodded, handing me a drink. It was bitter, but it helped, the ache in my head going away almost instantly, the acids in my stomach settling. 1-6 watched me for a few moments, and when I raised a hand to let him know I was better, he sat back, his own face passive. Then he sighed, deeply. 67 years ago that took place. I was 11. I watched as he reached inside his tunic and pulled out a corded piece of graphene-laced silk. On it was a simple wooden cross, scarred and burned with a gold ring around it. I couldn't help it. My eyes went wide. Our memory was shared across the clan, and then the other clans as well. My grandfather traveled to Ayr, found Kenneth's remaining family, shared his last days. He tried to return this to Kenneth's wife's family, but they refused. They gave it to him, told him to honor their son, to carry his memory, to pass it down. I don't believe they knew at the time how we do that, but their words resonated with him. Grandfather and the other clan elders who went with him swore a blood oath at Castle Roskalarn on Aerie, not just to his family, but all of the Terran's families, that if they ever needed our help, that we would answer. He paused, looking down at the cross he was holding. "Kenneth," he said softly, looking at his hand now, and for the first time I noticed the thin line of a blood oath running across the palm. "James, Yevgeny, all of the Terrans are righteous. Among us, their names remembered. My own firstborn was 11 Ken Neth. My third son is 21 Istven." He looked up as he said the last, and I saw his eyes. I knew that look. I couldn't help it. My eyes opened wide in shock. The Srenesh had claimed their families, bound their honor to their own. It was a rarity for the Srenesh to do that to anyone, outside of their immediate clan, let alone outside of the Srenesh, and before I could think of the consequences, 1-6 continued, putting the cross back under the tunic he was wearing. "It is possible, likely probable, that should you prosecute your war against them, they will call us for help, and the clans will meet, the khans will convene the great moot, elect a great khan, and then will raise the one banner, and all Srenesh with honor, all of them, will answer and fight for the Terrans. It's the primary reason this sector of their border has been quiet. It's a sledgehammer they can call at will, and they know it. But they have never called, you know why, yes?" I nodded. A threat was effective only when you could back it up. The implied threat of the Srenesh, and not just a couple of clans but all of them, willing to come help, was a powerful negotiating tool. It was a political sledgehammer of cosmic proportions, one we had missed entirely. All for a group of soldiers. Who helped you almost 7 decades ago? I couldn't help it. My voice was incredulous. 1-6 smiled. "Tlantosh," he said, picking the NIK back up, standing up and walking over to the cubby he pulled it from and putting it back in. "Our clan went to war after that incident. We spent 6 years going from system to system hunting down the Dragos Kith that attacked us. We destroyed so much of their infrastructure that they left the sector entirely and were destroyed by the Hamari a few years later." He came back over to me and with a proffered hand helped me to my feet. I was dizzy, but my head didn't hurt. Any more, my stomach settled from the experience, but roiling again with the new information I just had been given. The Terrans that helped us on Kithnia, they weren't professional soldiers, they were academics. Kenneth had a doctorate in geology, with an emphasis in fluid dynamics and physics. James was a surveyor and had a chemistry degree. Yevgeny was a pipeline specialist. They were hired to help us find and exploit the massive oil field in the region. None of them were professional soldiers, although several were hunters back on their home planet. The professionals didn't show up until it was all over. For reference, the prayer Istvan says is known as the Warrior's Prayer from Ephesians 6, verses 10-20. He repeats it from the Vulgate Latin version. The translation is, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Therefore, take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and, having done all, to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girded about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, take the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints. And pray for me, that utterance may be given unto me, that I may open my mouth boldly, to make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in bonds, that therein I may speak boldly, as I ought to speak. Surely there is something we can do, asked one of the analysts. We were gathered around a table with a display bowl in the middle, trying to figure out how to accomplish the task given to them by the Emperor. The Sranesh are closing their borders to our military ships, Aogus said. And I would advise not trying to use uninhabited systems as transit points. Even if they aren't populated, they are monitored, and the last thing we want to do is get them fighting us as one whole unit. We have spent too much time, energy, and money keeping them fighting each other. There were grumbles of assent around the table. The Emperor will not be happy to hear this, Doluagesh said, fingers tapping on table 2. Lying to him. To make him happy helps no one, I replied, and more than a few people looked at me. Where is the lie? I asked. No one answered me, more than a few looking away. We were tasked. What looked to be simple at first is proving less so. It is up to us to give the Emperor the best advice we can give him. I looked around the room, just to make sure there weren't any outward signs of disagreement. And then Warfather Jorkesh will take that advice, forget it, and start banging his head against every wall he sees, an analyst from Information and Security said after a pause. The table was quiet, and he looked up from his tablet. Really? He asked. Be that as it may, Aogus said, shutting down that line of conversation. What do we know? Not enough, replied Intel. They were a multi-system polity when the Avi discovered them, but other than their initial reports to the Federation, the Avi have reverted to type. That type being giants in the playground. The Avi existed long before the Galactic Congress. Hells they probably manipulated in ways we haven't even thought of, and we've thought of a lot the past few centuries. They occupied a small sector on the opposite side of the galaxy, and their borders were closed. No one knew how many planets they had, how big they were, but everyone knew their ships when they saw them anyways. When they did deign to talk to anyone, it wasn't so much as a conversation as it was them telling you what they were going to do and how you were going to be happy with that. No one argued with them, ever. Any polity that has more than 2 Dyson spheres and built a Penrose sphere around one of the larger black holes in the known universe you do not mess with. A frequent question, mostly asked in jest around the constabulary, was, is the Avi in the room with you now? Warm-blooded, extremely adaptable, and that before any sort of gen-engineering. Did they, the analyst from Health Sand Safety asked. According to my sources, who have read the initial Avi reports at Congress, they had done some basic health and adaptability mods. When the Avi showed up, they stopped, allegedly, but that just means those mods have propagated naturally. Just also means that they have the capability to do so. There were nods around the table. If there was one thing to get the Avi on the wrong side of neutral, it was genetic modification. Noon knew why. Rumant said in the early days of the Congress, there was a polity heavily into genetic modifications, and the Avi wiped them, out of existence in less than a year. Basic living modifications seemed to be okay to them, but there was a line that only the Avi knew about, that crossed from being fine to stop or we will make you. By the way, here's the trade agreement with Party A. You've been trying to get for 20 years if you do. Do they have a world preference? Asked an analyst near the end of the table. No, replied Intel. In fact, it seems if they can get an orbital body spinning enough for some sort of gravity, they'll build on and in it. When it comes to planets... His hands tapped away furiously, and we were suddenly on a planetary body with a large gas giant in the background, swirling clouds dominating the view. The view changed, and several people, including me, gasped. It was an industrial facility, and it was immense. Large buildings, towers, furnaces, and what looked to be compilers of some sort. Is that a Lovelock engine? Business asked. It is, Intel said. That meant as immense as it was above the surface, it was at least 3 times as big underground, and there was another one on the opposite pole as well. The cost, Business said, looking at it. I didn't disagree. The amount of resources and capital required to assemble and maintain a pair was enormous. Easier and less expensive to just take a habitable planet from someone else, Military said, under his breath. Thus was the way of the universe. Why spend your own time and resources when you can steal someone else's hard work? They are a multi-polity union, Intel said, and more than a few of us perked up. Forget it, Trade said, beating. Many of us to the jump. He looked at Intel, who nodded, and Trade leaned over his own tablet. Their home system, he said, and the view changed. A yellow sun, then planets, and asteroid belt, one with some spectacular rings around it, followed by a gas giant with an eye-shaped something that appeared to be looking right at you. Followed by another planet and yet another asteroid belt. The 4th planet was awash with lights, twinkling in their night. Several large orbitals were around the 2nd, 3rd, 4th planets. Then the view switched to some of the celestial bodies around the 2. Large gas giants, which also had several settlements on them. Many of the larger celestials had Lovelock engines on them. There were more than a few murmurs. Their homeworld is right on the edge of the zone, Science chimed in. You're referring to the 4th planet? Trade asked. Science and Technology nodded. That's because it's not their home system. The 3rd planet is. The view changed, and soon a large bluish-brownish marble hung before us. There was an involuntary shudder. The planet was at least 60% covered in water, if not more. Xlaesh rarely, do water. Yes, we need it to survive, but as a species who evolved from a mostly rocky, barren planet, whose oceans were barely a fifth of what I was looking at, we don't do water when we can't see land. At all. A thin, curving metal spire was at the planet's equator, ending in quite a large station. It looks... a plague, Trade said, and the table grew quiet. A limited nuclear exchange, and inter-system fighting about 200 years ago. The view changes to a city on the largest continent. It was quite large, a visible transportation network. Then as the view zoomed in, you saw damaged and destroyed buildings, huge skyscrapers of metal and glass, some shattered and torn, others broken in half. They destroyed themselves, Business said. Almost, Intel said. What information we have is at best 2nd and 3rd hand. These 2 continents, he indicated the 2 connected by a small sliver of land, were one polity. On the other continents, you had at least 6 or 7 others. 6 or 7? Trade asked. We haven't been able to get an answer yet. Some records say 6, others say 7. The catalyst? Information asked. Interstellar trade, they had settled. Quite a bit of the inner system built, and then the question of who's in charge came up. The belt wanted to rule itself. The planet polities said no, and essentially, a 3-way war broke out. Polities on the planet, backed by similar polities in the belt, fighting the belt that wanted to be independent. There were nods around the table. As near as we can tell, the plague started first, then the limited nuclear exchanges happened, and then they discovered their transit point. 50 years later, they had discovered 5 more transits from nearby systems. 50 years after that, 4 more, Then they encountered the Avi. That was 150 years ago. They are now at least 16 systems, if not more, given their propensity to settle anything, really. So the imagery from the home system? From a Gaunad merchant vessel, one of the few to visit their home system, from about 140 years ago. What are the odds we can drive a wedge between some of them? August asked. Slim and none, Intel said, and I blinked. There was always a fulcrum. Point that could be used. Greed, lust, family, friends. Intel leaned over his tablet and typed. This is from about 50 years ago, he said. A stellar map popped up, showing their declared boundaries and system locations, and then zooming to a system on the outside coreward edge. It wasn't the biggest system, but there was a planet with 2 moons right in the habitable zone, and while it was mostly empty, there was one continent that had more than a few lights on at night. This is Kanto. It was settled by the polity known as Nippon. Their view changed. A small settlement, buildings on fire, dead laying in the streets, the sounds of conflict. This is a village on the west end of the continent. The camera pulled back to show an open, water-covered field, parts of which were on fire, with a large, bulky-looking ship sitting in the middle of it. There were several doors open, with ramps extended. A door near the back opened, and a large, wheeled vehicle drove out. It looked slapdash, to be honest, like it wasn't meant to be used as a mobile gun carrier. It looked like one of the ore haulers I saw from 1/6 Blue Feather's memory. It was driving along what was essentially a causeway, and when it reached the main road heading into the village, it picked up speed, until a lance of light reached down from the sky and exploded it. The view changed back to the ship in the field, as it too was hit by several lances of light and then exploded in a massive fireball. A few seconds later, several smaller ships flew over the village, and soldiers in what appeared to be powered armor dropped out of them. Fast forward to scenes of firefights, house-to-house fighting, soldiers wearing a variety of different colored turbans treating wounded civilians. Then a new scene, outside of the village, a few days later apparently. There was a formation of soldiers in front of a tent with a large cross and crescent on it. A medical tent, I remembered. A small formation of soldiers dressed quite smartly, with turbans on their head, standing at attention. There was a pole with a flag on it, a red and green flag with some sort of creature, large ears, long nose, and what looked like oversized Govaran tusks near its mouth. A few minutes later, a convoy appeared, this time purpose-built weapons carriers. There was another flag on the front of one of the vehicles, white with a black mountain on it, rays of red behind it. Nippon. A short, stocky human exited the vehicle when it stopped, put a hat on his head, and went over the soldier at the front of the formation who saluted smartly, sword in hand. The flag on the pole came down, replaced by the flag of Nippon. The soldier from Nippon saluted, shook the other soldier's hand, and then they headed into the tent. The other group of soldiers is from a polity known as Bharatavarsha, Trade said. To put it simply, they loathe each other. There have been several minor conflicts between two going back centuries. Others around the table started talking over each other, until Trade and Intel finally shouted them down. It is like this. Trade said after a minute. I hate Intel. Intel hates me, he said, smiling at his counterpart. But we both hate business, and we may dislike information and security, but we will answer when they call for help. It's... Trade stopped talking, trying to find the right word. Doluagesh sighed, loudly. Everyone looked at him. The enemy of my enemy is my enemy, he said, and there were nods around the table. A question, Information asked. They seemed to have advanced quite quickly. From what we know, they went from heavier than air flight to space flight in about 50 years. 50 years after that, they started really exploring their solar system. 50 years after that, they had settlements scattered throughout. That's, Iogus said. Concerning, Doluagesh replied. I sat back and tried remembering my primary school history. Our own progress was similar, but the timeline was almost twice as long. They are risk-takers, Trade said. Explorers, too. Them going someplace new and dominating it is a challenge. I have a video for you all, but I warn you it will make you uncomfortable. He typed away for a few seconds, then the display lit up. There were gasps. It was water as far as the eye could see. No land at all, anywhere. The camera turned, and there was a ship, made of wood apparently, with cloth sails deployed to catch the winds, and it cut through the water at speed. The view changed. This time there were cries. The skies were dark, filled with rain and lightning, waves higher than the boat, which bobbed and toddled on the waves. The wind was roaring. The camera panned up, and we saw humans, pulling in the cloth by hand, tying it off around one of the arms, then scurrying back down rope ladders until they made it to the deck. Several slipped and fell on the deck, and either picked themselves up or were helped up by their shipmates. "What you think, Davy?" one of the men asked into the camera. "Cat 2. Maybe 2.5. But we'll be out of it in a day. This is just the edge. It dodged right when it was supposed to go left. Satellite says after this it's clear sailing all the way to Christmas. How's the nerd herd?" "Fine. Pills seem to be working. Anna says Jeff reported a pod of humpbacks in the area." "Really humpbacks? Wouldn't that be a treat? Right? You okay?" "Just a little wet. Get down below, get dry. We'll call for help if we need it." "Righto. Turn it off," I heard a strained voice say. Doluagesh was gripping the arms of his chair, face pale. A few seconds later, the scene ended, and there were more than a few sighs of relief. "That," Trade said, wiping his face with a napkin left over from lunch, "is a replica of sailing ship that they used to cross their oceans, I'm told. Earlier version were more primitive. Nothing more than rafts of wood tied together with ropes also made of plants." "How old is that?" Agriculture asked. He was quite pale. "About 50 years ago," Trade replied, and the table exploded. "Why? How?" I rapped the table with my hand, loud enough to cut through the noise, until they had all quieted down and were looking at me. "It's a hobby," I said, "like windsailing or climbing." Trade coughed, but I shot a look at him and he wisely chose not to say anything. Doluagesh coughed and stood up. "A quick break," he said, "to gather ourselves and out thoughts. Let us reconvene in 15 minutes. We have 6 months to put together something the Emperor will approve. It appears we may have to deviate from our usual methods, perhaps recover to some of the old ones to accomplish what we need to."
"We still need to solve how we get there," Aogus said. "One problem at a time," Doluagesh replied. "I need to go outside, feel the sun on my face after that." I nodded and watched the Emperor's hand walk away slowly. "Is there a particular reason they are pushing for a new conflict so soon?" I asked. Doluagesh and I were walking among the garden. It was probably bugged to a fare thee well, but that was expected. The Syndicate worlds are not being brought to heel as quickly as we had thought. For such a divided polity before that war started, they seem to have coalesced into quite an effective counterinsurgency. Our losses there are 15 to 20% higher than we forecast. We walked in silence for a minute. Governor Kendrati has become a problem. He's managed to get most of those who escaped to his own banner, rather the banner of the new Syndicate worlds, and the guerrilla campaign he's conducting is starting to get competent. There's also the fact we're going to have to bribe at least 3 polities for us to transit on our way to fight the humans. The laws were clear. A polity could declare itself neutral in a conflict, but those routes designated as interstellar. Trade routes had to stay open, and no conflict was to take place on them. Otherwise, the whole of Congress would be in an uproar. Not that things didn't happen from time to time, but the usual arrangement was the polity in questions charged higher transit fees, or required a huge deposit before letting a convoy transit, or could be paid to look the other direction. Arrangements could be made, and often were, for one of more sides to look another way, and you could always try your luck in the unclaimed regions, but those had risks all of their own. I read your report on your meeting with 1/6 Blue Feathers. I've received others as well. I will forward them to you. Give me a report in a couple of weeks on your impressions of them." "Of course." He stopped walking, and so did I. "I would ask a personal favor of you, Tlantosh." I nodded, but inwardly I was suddenly on edge. The Emperor's hand asking me a favor? This was not a common occurrence. You know there are several factions vying for his favor. I know at least one, and possibly three, are vying not for his favor, but his throne. I need you to remember your oath, and let me know what you hear and who you hear it from." "Of course, sir. Is it the usual suspects?" I replied. "Pro-expansions, anti-expansion, those who think we've bitten off more than we can chew with the Syndicate worlds, and that's because we are still in the late stages of incorporating the Valkamir. You know what will make such things easier, Dolu Agesh?" I started to say when I saw him freeze. Then he turned around and looked at me, eyes filled with fury. "The Empire will not be weakened by those unable to support it. I have told you before. I have told Senator Akakush and his party citizenship is our reward for good behavior, not a promise of good behavior. We learned that lesson the hard way. It is not one I wish to see repeated. If someone is going to be a traitor to their own people, it's just as easy for them to be a traitor to us. Now, no more of this talk." A few weeks later, we were in the conference room aboard the Lagai Shal, talking amongst ourselves, when Dolu Agesh walked in, flanked by several aides. He went to the central dais, told the room to lower the lights, and then the screens turned on. JX-119 was unclaimed system in between the Caxielian and Hemari, a small sun, 5 orbiting bodies, and a fairly significant belt. Task Force 1D17 was there because they were on their way to interdict the trade route to Adanos. They were taking the long way around because we were hoping to surprise more than a few people, throw the proverbial wrench into the works, and lean on the Liturgian. Commonwealth a little more? It was a good plan, until the task force ran into a Terran task force in the same system. We don't know why they were there. In fact, we didn't even know the battle had happened until TF-1-17 was reported late. Then we sent out scout ships to try and find it. Surviving ships were a couple of jumps away, battered, barely alive, held together by sheer will, ingenuity, and jury rigging that would have made the Kandethi proud. Data was sparse. The closer the rescue ships were to JX-119, the more they found out. Apparently what we were seeing was a somewhat edited video. It started as a meeting engagement. A screening element of the TF ran into a squadron of Terran ships, mixed cruiser and destroyers. The designs were different than those at Gunita, and visible on each ship was a flag. I recognized it.
Nippon dot white with a black mountain in the center, with rays of red reaching out behind it. The Terran ships retreated towards the jump point. More ships streamed out from the belt to join the fight, and the TF almost had them when most of the remaining Terran ships powered on and came out from behind the gas giant, where they had been hiding the last 6 hours of the fight. TF-117 reacted as best they could, but they had been pulled into a moving ambush. Even I had to admit it was skillfully done, and I wasn't the only one. It became a slugfest. Whereas at Gunida, the Terrans seemed quite adept at fire and maneuver. These Terrans were different. Several, if not all of their larger ships, had Marsa mounts. And even though they discovered early on that 1 or 2 hits would not have the desired effect, when they concentrated their fire, they knocked out several capital ships with the equivalent of EMP blasts. We all watched in silent horror as the Killanoth, the TF flagship, took several hits, watched as the lights and engines blinked off, then back on, then off again, and began to tumble. It took several ships concentrating their fire on it, but 20 or so minutes later, it was a broken hulk with atmosphere and chemical-fed flames, arcing into space from multiple hull breaches. We gave as good as we got, and in some cases, better. But in the end, both fleets were battered. There weren't any ships that were undamaged, although it appeared the most capable ships on either side made their way to their respective jump points. As damaged as some of them were though, there would be no way for them to survive a hard jump, or maybe a soft one, and the available evidence proved that right. We watched as the squads of Marines breached the wreckage of the Terran flagship, where they made their way to the bridge, encountering nothing but vacuum and dead bodies. The bridge itself was a slaughterhouse. One of our kinetics had hit the ship and bored all the way past the center line, within 10 meters of the heavily protected and fortified room. The shockwave alone caused considerable damage. There was something odd about many of the bodies though, as at first glance their injuries were all too similar. They killed themselves. Agus leaned over and whispered to me. I looked again, and he was right. Several of the bridge crew had survived the initial hit, but all had killed themselves. A bladed weapon of some sort, to the neck or chest. There was a chair near what appeared to be a holographic bowl. Sitting in was a slight human, wearing their equivalent of our skin suits. The camera focused on his face, impassive in death. For a being who had disemboweled himself, the hilt of his blade was still in his chest. He looked remarkably at peace. The camera view changed again. An external shot as the last of the Terran. Ships left the joint point about 30 seconds after they jumped. All the remaining Kanto ships exploded. The only race ships destroyed from their explosions were those already damaged beyond repair, still within the blast zones. What in the nine hells was that? I asked. A victory, maybe. Agus said, Hey everyone, if you enjoy these epic HFY stories, don't forget to subscribe. Hit the like button and drop a comment below to let us know your favorite part or what stories you'd love to hear next. Your support keeps the channel growing and the stories coming. Thanks for being part of this channel.